Tonight, thousands without power and evacuations begin as the state is hit with heavy rains that are expected to linger and cause more flooding in the weeks to come. Also tonight, frustration and anger at the memorial for the Bali bombings. And revved up and ready for liftoff, the race where the sky's the limit. Good evening, Tamara O'Dine with ABC News. Residents in Rochester in the state's north are tonight being urged to evacuate, and many more towns are nervously standing by after heavy rains lashed the state, causing widespread flooding. There are emergency warnings in place for the Goulburn and Campaspe rivers, as well as the Seven Creeks catchment near Euroa. Large parts of the state are subject to flood warnings, with rivers expected to keep rising in the next few days. We have reporters in flood zones across the state tonight. Josie Taylor is in Castlemaine, Michaela Ortolan is in Wangaratta, and Margaret Paul is at Dights Falls in Melbourne. But let's begin in central Victoria, where relief centres have already opened in Seymour and Echuca as residents make a last-minute dash to protect their properties.
A town trying to beat a river's unforgiving rise.
I think it's a bit more wetter today too, like.
What makes you say that?
Major flooding is expected in Rochester tomorrow morning.
I'm going to stay and fight it to the last man, pal. No, I'm not going anywhere.
Businesses are doing all they can to protect their stock, including some feats of ingenuity.
We've evacuated all our stock out, and now we're just lifting all our motors, anything that might get wet, we don't want to get wet, just lifting up to hopefully a satisfactory height.
But late this afternoon, the order was given to evacuate immediately.
With a flood the size that is predicted at the upper level, there is no area that will be safe in town.
There's also an emergency warning active in Seymour, which is facing its biggest flood emergency in decades.
I can say I've lived in this area for over 30 years. And it's probably the highest I've seen since I've been here.
A relief centre was opened this afternoon.
We can cater for up to 250 people to stay there overnight. We don't anticipate that will be needed, but the services is available there.
The flooding is widespread, with more than 12,000 homes across the state without power, from Swan Hill in the north to Colac in the state's south. The state's roads are a mess, forcing schools like Assumption College in Kilmore to close for the day.
We couldn't risk them not getting home. We would have loved to have kept them here overnight, but that wasn't, obviously going to be a good idea, so we turned the buses around.
The SES has rescued 10 people from cars in central Victoria alone, including this one in the Bendigo suburb of Strathfield Say, where football pitches are now swimming pools.
But I know I've gone through about 5 pair of socks and 2 pair of boots, so yeah. It's the way it is.
Other towns remain on edge. David Collivis took 14 months to rebuild his Carisbrook pub after the 2011 floods.
They're saying that we still might be flooded, but I don't know. Wait and see.
Until then, it's business as usual. Sarah Lawrence, ABC News.
Let's go to Josie Taylor in Castlemaine now. There's a lot happening in that region where you are, Josie. Can you bring us up to speed?
Tam, we've just heard that there's been an evacuation order issued for Carisbrook, which is a small town on the way from here, Castlemaine to Maryborough. That's just come through. Residents have been told there to evacuate. There was concern about a levee bursting there. The levee had not been properly built yet, and residents were concerned about that. It looks like there's been a big development there this afternoon. Since we left Seymour and did that interview with the Deputy Mayor you just heard, she actually contacted the ABC and said the situation had developed much more quickly than she'd expected. She wasn't concerned before about homes going under. She is now, and said then that the situation was developing quite quickly. As we travelled from Seymour across central Victoria to Castlemaine, there were lots of submerged paddocks, rivers raging with water, lots of water over the road, quite hairy. We've come here to Castlemaine. As you can probably see behind me, the electricity substation is in trouble. The creek here has risen really high. It's already started to get into the substation. The SES is really concerned that if it does get into the substation, that will knock power out to the town for what they've said could be 6 months. Powercorp has said that's not true, but they are concerned about power being lost to the town. They've told us they're bringing generators in now because that's a real concern.
Josie Taylor in Castlemaine, thank you. Let's check in with Michaela Ortolan in Wangaratta now. What's the outlook for the river systems in that part of the state, Michaela?
Well, Tam, I'm in Wangaratta, which it has been raining pretty consistently all day here. We're keeping a pretty close eye on two rivers, water catchments in particular. That's the Ovens and the King rivers. Now, the rain is expected to come overnight and into tomorrow, particularly hard in this area, which is why we're keeping such a close eye on those rivers. I'm not too sure if you can see behind me, but the community members, SES and local council have been setting up sandbags just in preparation for that rain to hit. We're not entirely sure what is to come, but we are bracing for the wet weather. Looking to other parts of the northeast, there are minor flood watches around the entire northeast, particularly around areas like Bright. We know with weather warnings in place, those alpine regions will also be particularly hard hit. The likes of the Hume Freeway is also closed between Avenel and Benalla, so the advice there is to obviously avoid those roads and to adhere to all emergency warnings that are in place. So for the likes of Wangaratta, where it's pretty clear at the moment, you wouldn't actually think that it has been raining all day. There's not much flooding in the area that I am currently, but like I said, the warning is for tomorrow and into the weekend, so we'll be keeping a close eye on those rising waters into that period.
Michaela Ortolan in Wangaratta, thank you. And Margaret Paul is at Dights Falls on the Yarra River. Margaret, can you give us a wrap-up of the situation in the metropolitan area today?
Yeah, good evening, Tam. It hasn't stopped raining in Melbourne all day. We've received about 20 millimetres in the past 24 hours for parts of Melbourne, but it's really been in the evening peak, unfortunately, that it's really started raining quite heavily about 5 or 6 o'clock as we were coming to Dights Falls here in Abbotsford in central Melbourne. Throughout the afternoon, there's been concern about the Maribyrnong River in the city's west. That's as that system moves across from South Australia across the west of Melbourne. It's really been filling up the Maribyrnong there. So the pub on the side of the Maribyrnong there in Maribyrnong, the suburb, has been sandbagging its doors to stop that water from getting into the pub. And residents nearby have been offered sandbags as well through the local council and the SES. Now, as that system moves across to the east, it will of course affect the catchment behind me, the mighty Yarra Birrarung, which is absolutely raging here at Dights Falls. But I'm told from speaking to locals, some of whom were kayaking here this evening, that they expect that as that weather system moves across to the east and starts to fill up the areas that feed into the Yarra, they're expecting the really dramatic rises in the Yarra River levels to be tomorrow and across the weekend, Tam.
Margaret Paul at Dights Falls, thank you. Well, the SES says the heavy rain and flooding could stick around for the next couple of months. La Niña weather patterns are expected to bring more rain over the next 6 to 8 weeks, topping up storages that are already brimming.
Our water storages are absolutely full. Our catchments are absolutely saturated. So every time we see reasonable rainfall totals, unfortunately, we're going to see some communities back under flood warnings again.
For more on that, Paul Higgins joins us now. Paul, how much rain did we actually get?
Well, Tam, there were some big rain totals overnight, topped by Strathbogie's 129 millimetres. Bendigo, Mangalore and Swan Hill all broke their records for a single day's rain in October. Since 9 o'clock this morning, the central parts of the state have been the wettest, the parts through there. And again, topping the list, Strathbogie, 58 millimetres. That makes a total of 187. After avoiding most of the heavy falls here in Melbourne, we had that line of moderate showers that moved through from the west late today, but again, many places missed out on those predicted heavy falls. The rain in the state's west is already on an easing trend, and I'll have more in our soggy state later, Tam.
Thank you, Paul. To the rest of the day's news now. And the federal government says it will register its concern with Indonesian authorities after graphic video of the Bali bombings was shown at a memorial event. Families and friends of victims had gathered on the 20th anniversary of the terrorist attack, but instead of it being a moment of quiet reflection, they were confronted with footage of the Sari Club ablaze and images of the bomb maker.
A candlelight vigil in Bali's famous night spot and a sombre ceremony after a day of memorial events. It was an opportunity to reflect through spirituality, song and symbolism. But around the time bombs ripped through Kuta 2 decades ago came graphic videos of the horror and the terrorists who caused it. The footage caused anguish for some survivors of the attacks.
Where is the respect? It certainly brought me back to 2002. It definitely took me back to 2002, but not exactly in the way I was going to be remembering my mates that I lost right now on this spot.
It's just ripped our hearts apart, seeing it all again.
The videos were prepared by Indonesia's counter-terror unit Densus 88, featuring the main bomb maker Umar Patek and Indonesia's de-radicalisation program. This was Jeff Marshall's first trip back to Bali since identifying his father, who died in the Sari Club.
It seems to be it's all about them, and we've been forgotten.
The Australian government has expressed its deep disappointment, saying it played no part in the organisation.
The videos and the other things that went on at that ceremony were grossly insensitive to the families of victims of the Bali bombing, and our government is going to be registering our concerns with the Indonesian authorities about that.
It was Densus 88 that organised last night's event, but what's distressed Australians most is the focus on the police response to the attacks and the terrorists responsible, rather than paying tribute to the hundreds killed. The anti-terror agency says its intention was to create a solemn and meaningful moment for those involved, apologising for any discomfort caused. Anne Barker, ABC News, Bali.
Jim Chalmers has described the global economy as on the edge during his first trip to the United States as Treasurer. Speaking in Washington, D.C. ahead of the G20 finance ministers meeting, Mr Chalmers once again ruled out changes to the Stage 3 tax cuts in his upcoming budget. He says the deteriorating global economy and risk of recession will influence his decision-making at home.
I think there's a pretty broad expectation around the world that there's a big risk of recession here in the United States, as there is in the UK, in Europe. The risk of recession in some of the major economies has clearly edged over from possible to probable, and that will have implications for us.
There are concerns that people will go to work and spread COVID now that mandatory isolation and support payments are ending. Most employers are still urging symptomatic staff to stay home, but some casual workers say they simply can't afford to.
Yanni Stavros won't get paid if he stays home with COVID.
It puts casual workers in a really tough spot because we have to make the decision between protecting the community and doing the right thing or actually paying our bills and paying rent.
Mandatory isolation ends nationally tomorrow. Major employers are still telling their symptomatic staff to stay home.
What we want to see is that our staff take their responsibility for their own health.
Many of Australia's 2 million casuals are young people working in shops, supermarkets and cafes. Leah Gregory hopes that her sick colleagues don't come to work.
Personally, for me, that's not the right thing to do.
Others feel they have no choice.
If COVID goes through my house, I've got bills to pay, I've got rent. I can't tell my landlord that I've had a week off, so I'm not going to be able to pay this week's rent.
Casuals were getting paid to isolate with COVID during mandatory isolation.
The federal government says that it can't keep subsidising the sick pay of all casual staff as the pandemic's emergency era comes to an end. Now, only those in key healthcare professions like aged care or disability will get paid up to $750 a week to stay home from work.
So if you genuinely want to minimise the risk of COVID, you've got to give employees appropriate compensation for staying at home.
Victoria is the only state with a backup plan. 5 days sick pay a year for casuals like Melbourne-based uni student Yanni Stavros.
The 5-day casual sick pay actually gives me some reassurance that I'm not going to be completely sidelined.
Showing that insecure work is still an issue, even though the lockdowns are over. Amelia Terzon, ABC News.
WorkSafe has completed its investigation into bullying complaints made by a former Labor MP against staff in the Premier's private office and says it won't take further action. Kshalia Vaghela resigned from the Labor Party in March after she alleged she was bullied by members of her own party. WorkSafe says it used coercive powers to gather information but found the Occupational Health and Safety Act had not been breached. In a statement on Twitter, Ms Fagella says she's disgusted with the conduct of the investigation and only had one telephone discussion with WorkSafe. Coming up on 7:30, how scientists from across the globe are teaming up to save the world from a climate change tipping point.
Cities cover only about 3% of the land surface, but they're responsible for about 20% of emissions.
It can be climate feedback, and if it is, we are in a very bad situation.
Cape Grim is getting really clean air coming off the Southern Ocean.
Also, I speak with former PM Kevin Rudd about the upcoming Chinese Party Congress.
Australia looks set to sign up to a global pledge to slash methane emissions by almost a third by 2030. But farmers look set to be spared a tax, despite methane making up almost half of the agricultural sector's greenhouse emissions.
Australian farms and feedlots produce plenty of hot air, thanks to farts and burps from livestock. The sector's been working hard to become carbon neutral by the end of the decade.
This additive has the potential of reducing carbon emissions by up to 90%.
By using alternative feed approaches, more might be needed if the government goes ahead with a plan to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030.
Our government is considering signing up to the Global Methane Pledge.
More than 100 countries got on board with the agreement at last year's Glasgow Climate Summit, but Australia refused because the junior coalition partner feared a pledge could morph into a methane tax.
Which you, the consumers, pay. Ultimately, you pay.
The opposition argues farmers are doing enough already.
I don't know, you can go around and try and stick a plug up their backside. I don't know, what are you going to do about that? You can tell them to be polite and maybe burp into a bag.
New Zealand is already proposing a so-called burp tax, and farmers are ready to revolt.
There'll be a hell of a lot of upheaval if they push ahead with this.
Last year, agriculture made up about 15% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. It was the fourth largest contributor, behind electricity, other energy sources and transport. The Federal Agriculture Minister's been quick to rule out any plans to follow New Zealand's lead with a methane tax. But the move to sign up to the aspirational global pledge might have given the opposition fresh fodder for a new scare campaign. Lucy Barber, ABC News, Canberra.
A far-right conspiracy theorist has been ordered to pay $1.5 billion to the families of Sandy Hook shooting victims. The verdict is the second large judgment against InfoWars host Alex Jones and his company for spreading the myth that the elementary school massacre was a hoax. Jones wasn't at court but vowed to appeal while broadcasting live on his website. Victims' families broke down as the verdict was read out. They say Jones turned their loss and trauma into years of torment.
It shows that the internet is not the wild, wild west, and that your actions have consequences.
Fresh anti-government protests have erupted across Iran despite lethal crackdowns by authorities. Riot and plainclothes police officers were out in force as demonstrators burned flags and removed their headscarves, chanting "Death to the dictator." The unrest was ignited by the death of Mahsa Amini while in the custody of Iran's morality police. It's become one of the boldest challenges facing the Islamic Republic since the 1979 revolution. Speaking on state television, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei said the protests were the work of Iran's foreign enemies, dismissing them as scattered. The US Marines and Japan's self-defence forces are conducting some of their largest war games on Japanese soil. The military drills come at a time of renewed tensions with China, North Korea and Russia, which has labelled the exercises a threat to its Far East.
Got it back till I believe in you. Used in Ukraine to stop hordes of Russian tanks in the early weeks of the invasion.
Target acquired.
Now the Javelin's being put on show for America's ally, Japan. Ferno! The smart missile locks onto its target.
I didn't really get to see it because I had to run, displace, but it felt good.
Costing more than $290,000 per missile, the decision to use it at bilateral exercises carries significant weight.
If we ever had to help them out in a mission, you know, we're going to bring our nice toys with us, our expensive javelins and other tools.
These exercises come at a crucial time for Japan's military planners. The country has long been set up on a strictly defensive footing, but Russia's invasion of Ukraine, North Korea's missile launches and China's increasing assertiveness is forcing Japan's self-defence forces to re-evaluate what it needs to be in the years ahead. Hideo Fukuzawa's island home off the coast of Japan was seized by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II, and it was never returned. 70 years later, he feels connected to those living under Russian attack.
I saw a child in Ukraine who was about the same age as me 77 years ago, crying and telling his mother he didn't want to die. It broke my heart.
Last week, Hideo Fukuzawa and his neighbours were told to seek shelter after North Korea launched a ballistic missile over the country.
North Korea is firing missiles as if it is having a tantrum. I think there are many worrying things happening compared to before.
Putting Allied forces on heightened alert. James Oaten, ABC News, Hokkaido.
To finance now, and bank shares surged again today, supporting another rise in the local share market despite global falls. Here's Alan Kohler.
Well, the big four banks are up by an average of 4.8% this week. Westpac has led the way, up 6.9%, with the others not far behind. It's because investors have worked out that rising interest rates equals rising profit margins, as lending rates go up more than deposit rates. It's happy days for banks, less so for borrowers, of course. Qantas shares jumped nearly 9% after the company said it will make a profit of between $1.2 and $1.3 billion this half year, after 5 consecutive half-year losses totalling $7 billion. Investors queued up for shares. HR software business Elmo jumped on reports of a looming takeover bid, later confirmed that it's looming. And health insurer NIB fell 12% after announcing a big capital raising to fund an expansion into the NDIS business. It's annual general meeting season, and here's what happens to share prices on average after meetings. They usually go down and then catch up about 3 weeks later. The American share market and the global index had their 6th consecutive fall last night to a new 2-year low for the US S&P 500. It's now fallen 25% this year so far. Commodities mostly fell last night, apart from a small rise in the price of gold, and the Australian dollar kicked a little higher against the US dollar, but fell against the British pound. And by the way, British financial markets are in crisis again, a fortnight after the last crisis. The yield on UK government bonds is back up to where it was when the Bank of England had to intervene to rescue pension funds. This time the pension funds have been told, you're on your own. And that's finance.
Brownlow medalist Tom Mitchell found his third home in the dying stages of the AFL trade period last night, with the Hawthorn midfielder landing at Collingwood. Fellow Hawks star Jager O'Meara was traded to Fremantle, while the Dockers offloaded forward Rory Lobb to the Bulldogs. Geelong secured young forward Ollie Henry from the Pies. The trades were all triggered in the final minutes before the cut-off after the Brisbane Lions finally brokered a deal with the Western Bulldogs for star midfielder Josh Dunkley.
I think the Lions as a football club, I've always admired them from afar, and the list that they've built and the exciting group that they've got, I think it's really bound for some success. So to be a part of that will be pretty special.
Australia has lost a second straight 2020 international to England, and with it, the 3-game series, going down by 8 runs at Manuka Oval in Canberra last night. Winning the toss and with their big-name bowlers back in the squad, Australia had England 4 for 54 in the 9th over. But David Malan and Moeen Ali added 92 for the 5th wicket, pushing England to 7 for 187 from their 20 overs. In reply, Australia lost wickets early and often, falling short despite the late fireworks from Mitch Marsh and Tim David. The home side remains confident it can make the fielding adjustments needed before the final match of the series tomorrow night.
It usually comes back to an attitude thing, or it's, boys might be a bit flat from the flights over to Perth and back. It could be anything, but yeah, it's mostly comes down to an attitude thing, and we'll be back on it next game.
Australia has broken a decade-long drought by winning the men's team sprint at the World Track Cycling Championships in France. The team of Lee Hoffman, Matthew Richardson and Matthew Glaetzer had a thrilling win over the Netherlands. The final margin was 0.043 seconds. The trio were joined on the podium by Thomas Cornish, who rode in the qualifying round. Glaetzer was a member of the last Australian men's team to win the title in 2012.
It's been a bit of a drought for us, so I knew we had a lot of potential in this team, but we were yet to be fully proven and yet to show the world what we are capable of. So super proud of the boys today.
The idea of flying cars has long been fantasy and science fiction, but now a company in Adelaide has brought that idea to life. Airspeeder is the world's first flying car race series, which is taking motorsport to new heights.
In a secret location not far from Adelaide, the future has arrived.
Drop it down.
Flying racing cars is the world's newest motorsport. Still in its infancy, developers have big plans for the series that will set the world alight.
That's the vision, is to be the pinnacle of motorsport with, and take our rightful place as one of the most exciting sports on the planet.
The vehicles have been designed, built and tested in South Australia, with the first ever race conducted earlier in the year. Airspeeder have recruited pilots from all over the world, including the nephew of Formula One royalty, Ayrton Senna. Former F1 driver himself, Bruno Senna, is Airspeeder's development pilot and global ambassador.
I hope that the racing background will help me in many things when it comes to competition, but also helping Airspeeder as an organization to try and build a racing series that's competitive.
Lexi Jensen has won multiple drone racing championships throughout Europe. One of the reasons she was lured into the series. These flying cars are currently being flown by remote control, but within 18 months, pilots like Lexi and Bruno are planning to be flying from inside the cockpit.
The first time they messaged me and they said, hey, you can race those things. And I was like, yeah, I'm already doing this, not interested. And they said, oh, but you can get in them eventually. I'm like, oh, okay, I won't do that.
Bringing 1960s Jensens to reality. Charles Bryce, ABC News.
Now he's back with more weather for us. Here's Paul Higgins.
Thank you, Tam, and I have to say it's nice weather for ducks.
Oh, very good.
But the rain is or will be easing tonight. However, that flood threat is far from over as the water barrels down those swollen rivers and creeks. There could be flooding for weeks, in fact. Rain cloud kept it relatively mild overnight, and the rain focus today was mostly over central parts of the state. The mildest spot was an almost dry Malakuta, where it got to 20 degrees. In case you missed it earlier, Strathbogie in the ranges northeast of Melbourne has had 188 millimetres of rain in the last 36 hours. And around Melbourne, 18 millimetres at Greensboro and also at Point Cook. Hardly any movement in the thermometer today, a high 17.5 at 5:34, and outside now 14 degrees. A deep low in the Bight and its associated strong cold front are tapping into tropical moisture and dumping all of that rain over the southeast. It will clear through eastern Victoria overnight, but tomorrow we've got this weak trough to bring a few showers to our south. Tomorrow, Sydney and Adelaide will have some morning showers in Hobart as well, but partly cloudy in Brisbane and sunny in Perth. Well, back home, that rain will clear through our east overnight and in the morning, but then some showers will follow tomorrow, mostly near and south of the ranges. It will be mostly cloudy, snow above 1,300 metres elevation, thunderstorms in the southeast, and there's a statewide warning to sheep graziers, as well as heavy rain damaging to destructive winds over elevated areas in central and eastern Victoria. We had a gust of 137 at Mount Hotham not long ago. At the moment, major flooding on parts of the Campaspe, Goulburn, Loddon, Maribyrnong, Ovens and King Rivers, the Severn and Castle Creeks and Mount Emu Creek, and moderate flooding on the Avoca, Broken, Kiewa and Werribee Rivers. That keeps changing, so monitor those warnings. A northwesterly wind on the bay, 15 to 25 knots, turning westerly to 30 knots early in the afternoon. Gales on the East Gippsland coast and strong winds on other coasts and the bays. Here's how that radar's looking around Melbourne at the moment, and I'm afraid the rain goes right out to about stall at this stage, so there's more coming up. Partly cloudy tomorrow, a few showers, the chance of a thunderstorm. Those showers becoming less likely late in the evening, 11 to 18 degrees. Saturday, partly cloudy, 18. Sunday should be mostly sunny, but the chance of a shower, 19. Then some mostly sunny days to look forward to. Monday, 18, Tuesday, 22, and Wednesday, a sunny 24, Tam.
Thank you, Paul. 7:30's next.